Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, December 11th, 2025. Another dear friend or brother, Alex Krainer from Monaco, is here with us. Welcome back, Alex.
Always good to be with you again, Nima. Thank you for the invite and greetings to the audience.
Alex, are you part of the oligarchs in Europe? You're,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
are you part of the oligarch elites in Europe? You
Yes,
live
of
in
course,
Monaco,
of course.
close to Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians.
Yes, I'm obviously part of the elites, not necessarily oligarchs. No, I'm just, how do you say, an ordinary family man doing his stuff and paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah. Please subscribe and hit like button and follow Alex Krainer. You see below his name, the trendcompass.substack.com, and we have our friends here in the chat, in the comments. They're putting the links there. You can access Alex Substack. Alex, let me start with the new document, which is important, in my opinion, is a drastic change in the attitude, in the way that the United States sees the whole situation with the conflict of Ukraine. The new strategy, the new Trump's new, I know, security strategy, national security strategy is pointing out, what is totally different from what we know from the British one. The British, they're talking about nationalism, they're going in this globalist idea of what we want to do with the case of Ukraine, as Ukraine be the first priority of Europe still. And on the other hand, you see the new attitude in the document on the part of the American and on the part of the Trump administration. They don't see Ukraine as a viable choice to continue with, and they want to change their attitude toward Russians. What is your understanding of the new document, and how is it different from the European strategy?
Well, as far as we can read it from the British strategy, it's the same. It's the same thing as always. It's a nicely dressed up globalist policy, which is committed to Ukraine. They don't care about Ukraine. They weaponized Ukraine as a weapon against Russia. So this is what they cannot give up. They are still committed to regime changing and partitioning Russia, balkanizing it to eliminate a powerful rival in their quest to uh, establish or re-establish hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. This is the same Macandarian strategy that goes back more than 100 years. The United States national security strategy for this year, by contrast, is a sharp turn from the status quo, because up until then, the United States was completely on board with the same globalist strategy as the rest of Europe, as their allies, let's call them, with the exception that the United States was shouldering most of the burden in terms of finance, in terms of weaponry, manpower, cannon fodder. It was all mostly resting on the American shoulders, and I think it's natural that at a certain point the American people get tired of it. So last year around November, people had the choice of continuing the same policies with Kamala Harris or changing. And so the only alternative was Trump. So they elected Trump. And so far, Trump, in his own unpredictable style, which is vulgar on the margins, let's call it that, is actually delivering. And I think that this national security strategy document that was just published is practically a beginning of a Cold War between the United States and Europe. And we've seen very, very hysterical reactions on the side of Europe, because one of the things it says, we can't have this NATO alliance that continuously expands. That's there. And for the Europeans, NATO alliance expanding is basically their fixation. They want Ukraine still in there. If they get Ukraine in there, next they're going to want Georgia in it, and Moldova, and Kazakhstan, and whoever they can get into NATO, the thing will try to continue to expand. So the Americans said, okay, no more, we're not interested, goodbye. And then the document also explicitly upholds the Monroe Doctrine. And so I think that it may be that what we're seeing now in Venezuela and the war of words against Colombia, that may be part of that.
Yeah. Alex, focusing on the situation in Europe, we know that there was a meeting in the United Kingdom. They came out, it seems, with a counter proposal to what the United States has proposed. And how far would Europe go against the United States in Ukraine? Are they getting to the breaking point? Is that sustainable for Europe to continue?
You're saying against the United States?
Yeah, because
No.
they're coming out with a counter proposal because they don't agree with what the Trump administration put in that document. They want something else. Even they're, it's amazing to see Zelensky is talking about he cannot accept territorial concession. This is the hardcore. This is the basis of the negotiation.
The European counter proposals are always calculated so that war continues. This is their priority, for the war to carry on. So the counter proposal is no territorial concessions, and Ukraine still has the right to join NATO. So that's already on the wrong side of Russian red line. So that guarantees that war continues. And Ukraine is losing the war. It's getting destroyed in the process. They're losing something between 1,000 and 2,000 troops per day. And these people are doing everything they can to continue the destruction of Ukraine and killing of all these troops. It's ugly. It's unconscionable. And it puts the Europeans in a direct conflict with the United States. Now, how far will they go in that conflict? I don't think they will go very far because they cannot. So, we've already seen warnings out of Europe that, well, if the United States insists on this peace, then we're going to dump $2.3, $2.4 trillion of U.S. treasuries. And if you dump all these treasuries in a short period of time on international market, it will collapse the price of U.S. treasuries. It will push up the price of U.S. Interest rates, and with it the cost of funding the American government, which is already, just to service the debt, just to service the interest on that is $1 trillion a year, which is more than $3,000 per man, woman, and child living in the United States. That's just to gain their right to exist to the bondholders. And now, you would push all this much, much higher, probably exacerbate inflation in the United States, jeopardize economic growth. So a very, very ugly, potentially very painful blow to the United States. But, Europeans have done a number of mistakes with venting these threats. They've shown themselves to not just the American public, but the world public as the lead warmongers. Because, before Trump, they were all pretending, we are blameless. We are just loyal allies of the United States. We follow the lead. And it's the Americans who are leading us into all these crazy military misadventures around the world. Now Trump says stop, and they are completely losing their minds. They want the war to continue, and they're doing everything, including threatening the United States, in order for them to give up on the peace negotiations. But the stupid part about it. So they mark themselves in the eye of the American public as the enemy, in fact, and as the lead warmongers. So now that becomes clear and undeniable. But then what they're also doing, I don't think they understand that they are threatening a power that has much, much bigger way of hurting them back. So let's say you dump all the US treasuries and you collapse the price of US treasury bonds, and you hike the interest rates on the global markets, and so forth. Well, the Europeans need US dollars because this is still the world's main trade settlement currency. So if you want to import oil, gas, coal, coffee, whatever you buy on the international markets, you need US dollars. And to get US dollars, you need to acquire them. European banks already have serious issues with US dollar liquidity. And for this reason, the Federal Reserve Bank has set up a liquidity swap lines with European banks, so that if they run out of dollars, they can draw on these swap lines from the Fed. Well, Fed can cut this off overnight, and then no more US dollars. And that could bring European international trade to grind to a halt. Then what are they going to do? Sell in euros? Are they going to force other countries to use euros as a trade settlement currency? They're going to say, no, pay us in gold or pay us in our currency. And so that's going to collapse the euro. It could spike up the interest rates in Europe. Like, basically, it would be a boomerang, but you throw a boomerang force 1 and you get boomerang force 5 in your face. And then, Trump is already looking for any pretext to hike tariffs on his trading partners. And, since the beginning of the Trump administration, the people around Trump have treated Europeans with a certain dose of irritation. And now this gives them, the justification to say, what did we say, 15% tariffs? No, wait, it's 500%. How about that? If they can get away with it, they will do it. So I think that the Europeans are acting like hysterical lunatics. And the mask of, culture and civilization has flipped off completely. They can't seem to let go of their colonial heritage. And they think that everybody in the world owes them something, and the United States owes them to continually do the dirty work and the heavy lifting at their own expense, because of our values, our shared values, because we're so nice. We're so, we're the garden. Everywhere else is a jungle. That's the mindset, not necessarily of the ordinary European in the street, who is also increasingly oppressed to the breaking point. This is the mindset of the governing establishment in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, in London, and so forth. And these people are very, very low caliber politicians. I have to share this story, Nima, because it's just amazing. Somebody finally put together a 15-minute video on YouTube of Kaya Kala's greatest hit. Okay, her various statements, and it's not 15 minutes of Kaya Kala. It's maybe half, and then the guy comments. So apart from her being staggeringly dumb, what you notice, like we hear her give a statement, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, and so forth from time to time, right? When you get her 15 minutes straight, you realize that she consistently speaks like daddy's princess. Her tone of voice, her gesticulations, demeanor it's all like daddy's princess, like a little. She always talks like a little girl. So not only is she staggeringly dumb, she's also revoltingly annoying. And I could not listen to the whole 15 minutes of this video because it got so annoying. But that's the caliber of leaders that we have in Europe. And it's not by accident. No, they were chosen to be clueless, stupid, and reckless, because you had qualified, competent leaders once upon a time in Europe, but they were slowly purged out of the system. And one spectacular example was German Admiral, I think his name was Kai Arno Schonbach, I think. When the war started in 2022, he was in India on some international defense-related event, some conference. And at that conference, he was saying, well, this crisis between Russia and Ukraine, the lowest cost solution is to simply recognize Russia's security concern, to treat them with respect, and to find a solution without waging war. He was sacked the same day. He tried to apologize. He tried to take back this word, but too late. They needed some mindless drone moron, apparatchik there, who, when they tell him go to war with Russia, he'll say, aye, aye, sir, go to war with Russia. Tell them that they have to sacrifice their children, aye, aye, sir. And then, the guy goes and tells the French public that they have to sacrifice their children. That's who rules over Europe today. And that's the reality. And the good part about this is that these lightweights are opposed by very competent and very professional leadership in Russia, in China, and in the United States.
Alex, Donald Trump had a phone call with European leaders. He said it was a tough, call. He was, directly talking to them. It seems that the nature, the tone of the talks were not that much, friendly. But when it comes to the way that Donald Trump and his administration is, communicating with Europeans, do you think that they're doing this in a proper way? Because I don't see, you've mentioned how the Trump administration can put a lot of pressure on these European leaders. Who are these people? Macron, 11% of people in France, Starmer, Merz, they have a lot of leverage to put pressure on them. But you don't see that coming. I see even in the Russian, the people in Russia, the leadership, they're so much confused the way that Donald Trump is dealing with European. Why is that?
I think that of necessity, Trump has to, because these are these are American former allies, and we have to keep in mind that Trump hasn't been in the White House a full year yet. This is a relatively new administration. There's a lot of entrenched thinking, legacy relationships and bonds between individuals and institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. And, you can't just overturn it all in one fell swoop. Not only that, they knew that Trump was coming back for some times, or they thought that he might. And they've, Trump proofed a lot of these relationships and ongoing projects and contracts and plans. And so, Trump couldn't come out day one and say, okay, we're exiting NATO, we're pulling out all the troops, we're no longer going to be allies with these Europeans, and we're going to be best friends with the Russians and Vladimir Putin. That's that's like moving the furniture in the house of blind. It's so. It seems to me that his approach has been very, let's call it, asymmetric. he's doing something that appears to be something else, and then only after a while you realize, okay, this is why they did this. This is why they said this. And I believe this to be the case since the start, but I was also thrown off a couple of times, and I have to say I'm still thrown off by the questions of, let's say, Venezuela and Argentina. I still don't understand what the hell they're doing there. But the Operation Rough Rider, when they started bombing Yemen, I thought that was extremely bizarre. So off the charts stupid that it couldn't possibly be what they were saying that it was. Then the fake war on Iran. Then all these statements of like, oh, I'm terribly disappointed with Vladimir Putin. Okay, that's it. We break off. Alaska is dead. We had that for a few weeks that everybody was saying Alaska is dead. The opportunity was missed. So for some reason, he feels that he has to do things this way, and he may be right. But as a result, a lot of us are guessing like what is going on. And then practically in everything they do, in every post, press release, in every document, there's a little bit of everything for everybody, because if you want to read this national security strategy document, you'll find very encouraging things in there, and you'll find very discouraging things as well. There's the military industrial complex there that expect their $1 trillion budget will be growing every single year. They expect this. And if you tell them, no, we're going to cut the budget in half, they're going to want you dead. There's the, making America healthy again, which is, potentially very bad for the big pharma. So they might want him dead too. NATO, now it looks like the United States, it might very soon pull out from the NATO alliance. Those people are going to want him dead as well. And so I think that explains the way they're dealing. And look, even these last, like 10 days ago, when Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Moscow, people have to ask themselves, why did he send Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Moscow? Why didn't he send Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State? That should be his job. Well, obviously, because he can't trust those people. He's sending people that he trusts personally. So that tells you how threatened he might feel and how fragile his whole agenda is, that he can't have Marco Rubio do his job because he feels it'll be scuttled, it'll be throttled in some way. So he sends his friend Steve Witkoff, who so far has been reliable and appears to be a well-meaning, decent man, and has done the job so far. So I think that this is the answer, that Trump is acting kind of under siege, with probably a certain sense of deep insecurity about people that surround him, not being able to know 100% whom to trust, who's loyal, who's not loyal, who's working for the other side. I think this is why even the Russians can't tell.
What Europe, in my opinion, fails to understand is that the United States has totally changed, or the whole world has totally changed comparing to what it was before the war in Iraq and Afghanistan breaking out. You remember, General Wesley Clark, he was, saying that, why are we going to Iraq and Afghanistan or even Libya or all these countries that we are big, we have a lot to spend there. Right now, the United States is not in the same position anymore, and Europe doesn't understand it. That's why the United States doesn't want the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine. And
yes,
it's not even Iraq and Afghanistan, it's Russia,
Yeah. Yeah, but you see, I think that the Europeans, and we have to say primarily we should be talking about the British foreign policy establishment. They don't care. They don't need to win wars. What they need is to keep the key regions of the world perpetually destabilized. Because so long as they're destabilized, they always have the opportunity to go in there with their, diplomats, with their intelligence agencies, with their um, NGOs and charities and media organizations and so forth, and like a parasite, penetrate the system and spread their influence and maneuver them to their advantage. And they're doing that everywhere except they can't do it in Iraq, in Iran. They can't do it in Russia. They can't do it in North Korea. They can't do it in China. So these countries, and I don't know if they can do it in Venezuela. That's like an open question. But this is why these countries are now at the targets of the empire. And if they can't win over by these covert means and through their soft power, then the United States has to be there to start dropping bombs and send special forces and things like this. And so once the United States says, okay, I'm done, I'm not doing this for you anymore, they all lose their minds because they don't have other ways of doing it. Well, they apparently, the British intelligence networks control most of the jihadi forces around the world, and they probably control most of these neo-Nazi militias and battalions in Ukraine. So once they lose in Ukraine, probably they'll try to extract most of them elsewhere to do terrorism and sabotage and assassinations around Europe and the United States and wherever else they need them. But this is not a military. You can burn things up. You can assassinate leaders here and there. You can cause terror attacks. Like in Europe in the 1970s and 1980s, you had Operation Gladio being run by NATO. But as far as we knew, these were far left communist militias and terror organizations, but it was all run by NATO, and we know that now for sure. So I think that they will try to reconstitute this, but still, if you're going to take down Russia, you're going to need bigger caliber weapons. And I think that at this moment, the only place that that's available is the United States, and Trump is not willing. And so these people are very, very hysterical, very angry, and very confused because they don't know what to do. There's no plan B.
I think the key is the British and the British government, because looking at what's going on in Israel, you would ask yourself, what does Israel have to do with the conflict in Ukraine? Why are all these Zionists in the United States are all supporting Ukraine?
Yes.
This is the key. Who's behind this? What is your understanding of that, Alex?
My strong suspicion is that it's the British who are behind Israel, that it's the British who are behind Zelensky and behind all the neo-Nazi militias and brigades and battalions that are active in Ukraine. And this is why they have so much in common, why the Israelis support Ukraine, why Ukrainians supported HTS when they broke into Syria and took down Bashar al-Assad government. They brought their drone operators because they had all these soldiers who knew how to fly first, those FPS and other types of drones. So it's all connected. You see, I always go back to 2021 speech by George Soros at Davos, where he says, what we're witnessing in the world today is the clash between two systems of governance. And so Israel, Ukraine, Syria, they're just different battlegrounds of the same war. It's the war between the global empire, the rules-based global order, and everybody else. Soros says open societies versus closed societies, but in reality, it's the world empire against everybody else, whether it's democracies, autocracies, dictatorship. It doesn't matter. If either you're their vassal or you're their enemy. And so everybody who's not their vassal is their enemy, which is, again, Russia, Iran, North Korea, China. They're smaller enemies, but they're not so bothered because, once you're rid of Russia, then it's much easier for Iran to fall. And you can then use Russia against China in the same way that you use Ukraine against Russia. This is what they do. This is how they do it. And so this is the conflict, and this is what connects them, because otherwise, it's very, very strange to explain why such a small country with a small military, which is basically geared for anti-insurgency warfare, whose economy is practically broken, whose social services are practically disintegrated, surrounded by, enemy nations, active on 7 war fronts at the same time. How are they so powerful? How do they have these irresistibly powerful lobbies in Europe, in the UK, and in the United States, that they appear to have all the politicians wrapped around their fingers? That's not, the explanation, the Jews, they're better organized and there's many wealthy Jews, so that's why. I don't think that's the truth. There's many wealthy Russians, and there's many wealthy Arabs, and there's many wealthy Africans and Indonesians and South Americans. What sets this group apart? And I think that what sets them apart is that they enjoy the cooperation of British, American, Israeli, and German and French intelligence networks, that they are that they enjoy the support of the media that are also under the control of this global imperial establishment, and that they are networked in through all the methods that the British have traditionally used, i.e., charities, NGOs, media company, public relations companies, lobbyists, and so on and so forth. I think this is the key to their power, and that always traces back to London. It's not that little Israel there controls everybody else. It's London that always works through proxies and empowers these proxies with the deliberate objective of hiding their hand. Because otherwise, if everybody saw that, is the British behind the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen? Is the British who are behind Turkey when they took down Bashar al-Assad? It's the British who are behind Israel, Myanmar, India, Pakistan, everywhere. Then people will say, okay, look, sanction these people to death, blockade the island, expel all the diplomats, everybody, and let's put an end to it. No, they have to hide their hands. So they always, even in the Balkans that I've observed, basically they'll set up NGOs in Croatia, they'll set up NGOs in Serbia. And then Serbian NGOs will fund provocations and sabotage actions in Croatia. And then Croatians figure it out and they say like, it's the Serbians who are doing this to us. And then, they have NGOs in Croatia who fund provocative actions against the Serbs. And then the Serbs investigate and they find like, it's the Croatian who are doing this to us. And next thing you have the two fighting. It's like the old Irish proverb. If you see two neighbors fighting in the morning, you can be sure that one of them had dinner with an Englishman. Unfortunately, this is unfair to, the 99% of British people who are decent, who are just like everybody else. but their establishment has been uh, the the epicenter of the poison that's been infecting the whole of humanity for over a century now.
I think there are some codes in the way that we get, the way that the leaders are talking, and one of the codes, in my opinion, it's important that Netanyahu coming out and talking that China is the enemy of Israel right now. How in the world can you talk about China? You know, it seems that you're gonna find with you want to fight with the elephant. How is that possible? Israel is just, they cannot fight Hamas, and they're talking about fighting China. This shows, putting this picture together with what's going on in the United Kingdom, the way that they're somehow escalating their rhetoric, their enmity toward China, it makes sense to me. And I don't see that coming from the United States. We had Donald Trump calling, the I don't know, is the president of Japan or prime minister of Japan asking her to calm down, not go that far. But you see the opposite way happening in the United Kingdom. They want to escalate that.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. They want to escalate everything, but they always put the proxies in the harm's way, and even now when you listen to Keir Starmer and he's talking about protecting Europe from Russia, he's not saying we are going to protect Europe from Russia. It's like Germany and Britain are going to protect Europe from Russia. So they're already volunteering German men and women to be the cannon fodder in whatever happens next. And they already have the military cooperation agreements with Poland and Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Ukraine and Romania and Bulgaria and everybody. They have practically with every country, they have a secret or semi-secret military cooperation agreement that is not even that's outside of the framework of NATO. They're already all allies within NATO, but they always have some kind of a separate cooperation agreement. And then that country ends up being at war with whoever the Brits need them to be at war with. That's been going on for more than 100 years, Nima. That's how they got World War I started. They got they had Entente Cordiale with the French. They've been at war with France for centuries, since the time that, not the creation of Bank of England, but since Bank of England got a monopoly on money creation, which was in 1825, I think. Since then, until World War I, they waged, I think, something like 19 officially declared wars against France. And maybe I got the years wrong. I'm sorry, but maybe from the creation of Bank of England, not since the 18. It doesn't matter. But they, in a space of about 100 years, they waged 19 officially declared wars against France. And then they decided they need to destroy Germany. And so they turn around and they establish this friendly understanding with France, Entente Cordiale. Basically, they're kind of maneuvering France into attacking Germany, into going to war against Germany. And then they realize, okay, well, Germany is very powerful. We're going to need more than just this. So we're also going to get the Russians to attack Germany. So they, go to Russia, and they have all these agreements and all these lobbyists and diplomats and intelligence assets. And they manage to maneuver Tsar Nicholas II's government to opening a war front against Germany. Then they do the same with Italy. They get them to be neutral at the outbreak of war. And then a year later, in 1915, they get the Italians to attack Austria-Hungary, ally of Germany. So this is what they do. And this is the playbook that they have kind of developed and perfected. and they want to perpetuate it because it has served them well for the last 100 years. The problem is that by now the Russians have read the playbook too. Russians study their history. The Chinese have understood the playbook. The Iranians have understood the playbook. And I think that many people in the United States also understand the playbook. The bonds with the United States are a bit harder to break because of the language. Language is always very, very important. And then, there's still a lot of Americans, particularly among the, let's call it educated liberal classes, that are still bedazzled by British accent. And so, they'll buy anything if it's told to them in British accent. But I think that even this is getting old and tired.
Yeah. Alex, here is what the current chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff said about the policy toward China in the United States.
The rise of the Chinese military. What our goal in the Joint Force is to create multiple simultaneous dilemmas for all of the adversaries around the world, so that they are very cautious and concerned about doing something that would bring any sense of threat to the American people.
Alex, do they really think that they can manipulate this? The way that they're talking about how to manage China, Russia, and even Iran, it seems to me that is not working anymore, because these countries, as you mentioned, they know what's going on with the case of the United States. They know what's the main goal of the United States. I think what's going on with the case of Venezuela, as we're talking about it, Donald Trump is coming to the Western Hemisphere and they want to dominate the Western Hemisphere. I don't know, it's the way that they're doing this. They're making enemies here in Latin America. They're not making friends after all.
You're absolutely right. And I have to say, I don't know exactly what this, I forgot, what's the name of the man? I didn't catch it.
It's the chairman. I don't know his name. He's the chairman and Joint Chief of Staff of the United States.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what exactly he meant by what he said. I have the sense that their Monroe Doctrine with respect to the to Central and South America is very much wrong-headed, and I think that we spoke a moment ago about. I think there's a kind of entrenched thinking in the American ruling circles. And I think that there's a lot of legacy relationships, and some people are still in the Cold War with their heads, and rabidly anti-Russian and rabidly anti-socialist. And
sorry for interrupting you. His name is General Dan Kane.
Dan Kane. Okay. Yeah. I don't exactly understand what Kane is saying there. Monroe Doctrine does make sense in a way that they didn't teach us in school, that, the United States felt secure between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, but it was vulnerable in the South and it was vulnerable in the North. And in the North, the threat was from the British Empire, as it still is. And in the South, the French tried to control Mexico, and during the Civil War, they brought troops to invade the United States on the side of the South against the Union, and the British wanted to invade from the North also against the Union on the side of the South. So in that sense, there is a genuine security concern for the United States, and Canada is still a security concern, because we see that a lot of these drugs, this fentanyl that is flowing into the United States, is in fact coming through Canada, and Canada has a number of these very large labs where these precursor chemicals are being synthesized to make fentanyl. So this is real. And in this sense, you can understand Monroe Doctrine as something that was justifiable in the 19th century. Today, it seems to me that the Trump administration is approaching this Monroe Doctrine more as, we're going to be the hegemon, and it's going to be the way we say. And the reason why I feel this way is because I can't work out why they bailed out Milei in Argentina. I honestly, I can't work that out, because that just seems completely insane. You know, if Milei's economic policies were working, why did he need $40 billion bailouts? Why? It's obviously failing. And so you're throwing US taxpayers' money to bail out a failure. Now, Milei is, ideologically close to the Americans, because he's all free markets, free enterprise capitalism, all these things, but basically it's all labels. It doesn't matter whether it works. It doesn't matter what it means, just so long as we are, team capitalism. So they're rescuing him. But Milei, also, one of the first things he did when he came into power is he shipped off all of Argentina's gold to London, not to New York, not to the United States, to London. And then, he goes to Jerusalem, comes to the Wailing Wall, and completely loses his mind. So, is he your friend? Or is he a pawn of the British Empire? Why did you bail him out? Okay, so that to me is very weird. But the only way I know how to explain it today is because Milei seems to them ideologically aligned with them, and maybe as such he will prevent a wave of socialist governments taking over South America, which is what they seem to be afraid of. And so, same reason attacking Maduro in Venezuela. Now, I appreciate that there are other reasons, that there's all this complicated stuff with regards to Smartmatic and Dominion voting systems, and I don't think the drug story is true at all. But they might like some kind of Milei to be running Caracas and Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia, and everywhere, so that everybody's team capitalism. To me, that's wrong-headed, because you don't really need that. People, countries that call themselves socialist also trade. They also drill oil and grow cattle and bananas and coffee and sell them on the global market. You don't need a Milei in every South American country. And if you get them, they're all going to be, aligned with London, and you're going to be having to bail them all out to stay team capitalism, so that the right label is on their, on their uniforms. So that I think that in this sense, I'm having trouble with Trump's Monroe Doctrine, and I think it's still the result of their heritage thinking and entrenched ideas that they should really overcome and rethink.
Yeah. I think what they fail to understand in Washington, what they fail to understand in the United States is that the era of zero-sum game is over. That's done. You cannot negotiate. You cannot force people into something, because right now we have BRICS, we have China, we have the global South. They have the other way to go. And you have to show, for example, here in Latin America, you have to show some sort of kindness, some sort of sense of cooperation with the countries here, to be closer to them, not going against them, not forcing them, as they did here in Brazil.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. That would be a better approach. But I think that some people are still, for them, the label socialism is like the red cloth for the bull. And they feel that they have to take it down because, maybe if they're socialist, then they're going to be aligned with China. You could always deal with China and say, like, okay, look, you have access to this market, but we want access to these markets as well. we can agree how to interact here, how to share this part of the world, how to be partners with these countries and among us ourselves, than to say, okay, we're the boss here, we're the hegemon, everybody else out, and we don't want you to trade with China anymore, and we definitely don't want you to be team socialism. You need to be like Milei.
Yeah, because you remember during, here we had a president in Brazil called Bolsonaro. He wanted to have a better relationship with the United States, and during the Trump administration, Trump, 1.0. But you don't see that much of change in the way that they see, BRICS. They see BRICS as an alternative here in Brazil. They would never get a Milei here in Brazil. Never. That is impossible to get someone like Milei here in Brazil. And I would argue in Colombia and other important countries in Latin America, it's not possible to get someone like Milei.
Yeah, well, I think even in Argentina, it took a lot of probably creative electioneering footwork to get Milei through the door. And there was a certain level of disgust with the Kirchner camp and their corruption and so forth. But then you amplify and exaggerate all that in the media, and I never understood what was the appeal of Milei other than the declared ideological leaning. He said, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So like everybody who has this right-wing leaning and who likes Austrian economics, they became fans of Milei like he's a rock star. But he was saying like he's going to get rid of the peso and use and dollarize Argentinian economy. I don't know. I don't understand if people get what that means. It means that you're handing your nation's sovereignty to Wall Street, basically, to the Federal Reserve Bank. And you can no longer manage your economy in a sovereign way if somebody else issues your currency. So you would effectively be making Argentina a colony of Wall Street. How is that patriotism? How's that capitalism? How's that anything at all? And then, one of the things that he was promising to the Argentinians was like he's going to get the Falkland Islands back. He hasn't made a peep about the Falkland Islands. Nothing. He only sent Argentina's gold to London. I think this was a yet another grand deception by the rules-based global order against the people. And why Trump is bailing him out, I don't understand that one.
Yeah, shifting the gear, Alex, a little bit to what has happened in the Middle East. We had a summit in Qatar. They all came together talking about the situation in the Middle East. Looking at the way, on one hand, there are people so much pessimists, they don't see anything coming out of these sort of summits. But in my opinion, that was a positive summit, because you see Iran, even those people in Iran who were so much, in the who were so much, advocating for a better relationship with the United States, somehow backing down. They see that is not possible with the United States. We had Zarif. He was, he's the architecture of a better relationship with the United States. He's the architect of, of that ideology. But he said that we are not going to go in that direction anymore. We are getting back to resistance. How do you see the situation in the Middle East? We had the summit, even we had the meeting between Iranian foreign minister and the Saudi Arabia, his counterpart in Saudi Arabia, together with Chinese again. After that rapprochement, coming together, and after all, having the former, the head of intelligence of Saudi Arabia, Turki Al Faisal, coming out and saying Israel is the biggest threat to the stability of the region, is not Iran. This guy was behind all of this, supporting all of this radical movement in the Middle East, in the West Asia. Right now, he's totally changing his mindset toward Israel. What is your understanding of the long-term changes that I think that they're already in the process of shaping in the Middle East?
I think this started with U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, because what was, the loss of Afghanistan, not in and of itself, but what happened then in August of 2021 is that you saw the president of Afghanistan and the governor of the Central Bank of Afghanistan having to flee the country with, duffel bags full of money, catching helicopters and private aircraft. And I think that they went to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, then, they went to UAE. They had to find a place that will accept them. The very loud message of that episode was that the empire can no longer hold on to their dependencies, and that they can no longer afford protection to their agents and their allies or vassals, and so that means that you're at risk. When you have to take duffel bags of money and catch a helicopter out of the country, that means the protection racket no longer works. And so I think this is where the avalanche actually started going. And now I think that this new situation with Israel, well, it's not new, but I think that this situation only made it worse, because it showed that Israel cannot be defended. It shows that the United States is powerless to defend them. When Ansar Allah started launching rockets into Israel, the Americans and their NATO allies launched the Operation Prosperity Guardian. That was in December of 2023. And the Operation Prosperity Guardian were supposed to keep the Red Sea open to maritime traffic. They were supposed to be protecting ships going through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. Well, they were not able to. They basically lost. The French and Italian, when they realized that the Yemenis can target them and destroy their ships, they just ran away. And the Americans in the end had to make peace with the Yemenis and ask them to please don't strike our ships anymore. Thank you very much. We'll stop bombing you too, and we can live happily ever after. So that's what they did, because they couldn't. And so I think that this is the writing on the wall that is becoming discernible to everybody, that you can no longer, because the protection by the empire allowed them to deal in an arrogant way, not only with their neighboring countries, but also with their own people, because their job was to oppress their own people for the benefit of the empire, right? And you can do that if you're protected. If you're not protected, you can no longer do that. So you have to make nice with your neighbors, and you have to make nice with your people. And so we saw that in the aftermath of Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia and Iran made peace. It was initiated by the Russians. It was brokered to the end by the Chinese. But this was I think that this was the impetus to get them to rethink, the Saudis, to rethink their future in their region. That the Americans can no longer protect you. NATO can no longer protect you. You have to rely on good neighborly relationship with the other regional powers for your protection. And then obviously, Israel was put there in order to be the destabilizing influence. So now this is obvious to everybody. And I think the longer term future is probably that the region will be stabilized, that all these forever wars are going to wind down to a halt at some point. And I think that Israel will either have to be radically reformed or it will disappear.
I think what you mentioned in the case of Saudi Arabia is important, considering the agreement they had with Pakistan, to provide them with some sort of nuclear umbrella. And then you see Iranian, the head of national security of Iran going to Pakistan saying that there is no limit. There is no limit to cooperate with Pakistani government.
Yes.
And even during the war between Iran and Israel, one of the few countries who were somehow cooperating and helping Iran was Pakistan. It's important because that was mentioned in the media in Iran. They were somehow, I don't know, sharing intelligence with Iranians about what's going on. But it shows how things are somehow changing, and Pakistan all of a sudden becoming some sort of alliance with Saudi Arabia. What the point of that? If the United States is in Saudi Arabia, they're gonna support. It seems that uncertainty on the part of the leadership in Saudi Arabia is growing. That's why they need more friends in the region instead of relying basically completely on the United States.
That's exactly it. That's exactly the transformation that is happening. And I think that is going to continue happening, and particularly with Trump administration that obviously has the intention of, extricate themselves from their region and focusing on their own hemisphere. I think this is all a good thing. I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is a positive thing because it also has to have a security component. And so this is now under Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is maturing. It's growing teeth. It's building capabilities to police the continent against extremists, against separatist groups, and so forth, which were all being used as proxies of the Western Empire. And I think that over time, the future of the whole continent is going to be very different from what we knew for the last 200 years. And I think that that's all going to be positive, welcome changes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex, for being with us today.
Always a pleasure, Nima. Thank you. Take care, and until the next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.